Yeah.
So it has been a long time, and it's funny because Brett Smith and I are close friends, and we knew each other through tree planting, and also because the group of the tree planting company we work for was sort of run by these Baha'is. In fact, Michael Carlberg, some of you might know Michael Carlberg from his amazing writing and academic work now. He was our foreman. But it was funny because Brett and I were the Baha'is, and we were basically like, I don't know how you want to describe it, but speaking for myself, pretty crazy and pretty out there. And Maureen was like, at the time, you weren't technically a Baha'i, but you were kind of already embodying so many of the Baha'i virtues and qualities and setting a very high standard for the rest of us. Such a sweet and wonderful person you are. So thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I wrote a little bio or a little blurb about what I would talk about, but I always try to, every time I give some kind of talk about my art, I always start from scratch. Even when I'm doing a lecture at school, I try to do a new lecture every time. And sometimes that can be exciting and lead to new interesting things. And sometimes it can be, it can leave me a little bit vulnerable and exposed because I haven't premeditated everything. So when I started thinking about meaning, the idea of meaning, because for me, art, like looking at a painting, for example, a lot of people will say, well, what does it mean? And I actually don't know if that's a very interesting question when it comes to art. It's sort of like when you look at a sunset, you know, if you see a beautiful sunset, I don't think anybody stops to say, well, what does it mean? Or like rocks, you know, if you see a mountain and you're looking at a rock face and there's like a waterfall coming through it, very few people I think would stop and go, what does that mean? But on another level, that's actually kind of what I think the purpose of our lives is to see that waterfall or that child or that, you know, that flower or that building or whatever, and to ask ourselves, what does it mean? And I think ultimately this question of meaning is very closely tied to a question of purpose. So if you have meaning, you're doing something that you really feel moved to do. Like if you have a job, for example, that you're really excited about when you wake up in the morning, you just can't wait to get to the job. You can't wait to get back into what you were doing the night before. It means that there's something very purposeful in that. You're deriving a lot of meaning from that. But I think a deeper question about meaning and purpose is, what is the meaning or what is the purpose for our lives? I'm going to switch to the gallery view. So oftentimes in a theological context or a philosophical context, people might ask, what is the purpose of life? But even saying that, it almost becomes like a cliche, or it almost becomes like a question that nobody really wants you to ask them. It's either way too big and I can't think of what the purpose of life is, or it's so innocuous or it's so everywhere that it doesn't have any meaning. I mean, I think we live in a time where there's a crisis of meaning. So what is the purpose of life? And you know, all throughout the Baha'i writings, there's mention about this question of the purpose of our earthly existence, the purpose of our time on earth. And Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, says that not only should we ask ourselves what our purpose is, but we should reflect on death. And it's an interesting thing because some cultures see reflecting on death as being morbid. You know, like maybe emo, like you get black fingernails and dye your hair green and you reflect on death or something. But actually, Abdul Baha really encourages us to meditate upon our mortality. And I think it's a very interesting thing to do, because I was driving with a youth a couple of days ago, and he was a youth that had been quite active in the junior youth program, and he had gone through all of those sequence of books with the junior youth program, and kind of in the last, say, year or two, kind of fell away from it. But I rekindled a conversation with him. I rekindled our conversations, our friendship. And I just said to him really candidly, I said, you know, this isn't about the Baha'i faith or the junior youth program or anything. I just really want to be a friend. Like, I want to maintain our friendship. Like, I really, and actually in my heart, I have a lot of love for this youth. And I said, you know, I'm really proud of you for how hard you're working to get a job and to finish high school and to buy a house. Like, he wants to buy a house and have a career. He wants to go into a pharmacy or something like that. And I said, you know, I'm so proud of you for all of this, but I also don't want you to lose sight of the spiritual side of our lives. And then he's like, yeah, I know, I won't. And then I'm like, you know, like, what is the purpose of all this? And I asked him, so what is the purpose of life? And he said, you know, family. Family is the purpose of life. And in some way that is a very profound answer. But I said to him, well, even mafia, you know, even a mafia don has a family. Like, you don't have to necessarily be a really wonderful person and have a family. It's sort of how you treat your family. He said, yeah, but, you know, for me, family is really important. I said, okay, well, what else? And he said, getting a job. And I said, okay, so let's just imagine you've got the perfect job, you've got a perfect family, you've got a lovely, you know, life. Then what? He said, well, then that's like it. And I said, yeah, but then you're gonna die. He's like, oh man, you know, that's depressing. And I'm like, it's only depressing if your whole goal is centered on this earthly life and getting a job and getting a house and having a family. Then yeah, it is kind of depressing, because in the end, none of us, zero people sustain that. We all are going to die. And I said to him, you know, we studied all this stuff in the junior youth material. He did book 1, he did book 2, we did book 4, we were on book 4. Anyway, and I said, so going back to, I said, what happens to you when you die? And then he said, well, I come from a Buddhist background and I'm kind of torn. Part of me thinks when I die, it's just like turning a television set off. Everything just turns off. But another part of me kind of believes in reincarnation. But I don't really believe in reincarnation, but that's what I've been led to believe. And I looked at him and I said, after all the years in the junior youth program, and after doing book 1 and all that, the best you can come up with is, I kind of don't believe in reincarnation. And he's like, oh, no, I believe in that stuff too. I said, okay, so what did we study? What did we look at? Anyway, the long and the short of it was, we were having this conversation that led to this place where, why are we alive? What's the point? And so I think that's a good intro to what I want to discuss, because I think without a point, without a reason, without a kind of driving purpose, nothing that we talk about is meaningful. Religion is not meaningful unless we believe that there's something undergirding that informs our true identity. Anyway, so another way to look at the question isn't what happens when you die. Another way of looking at the question is, how does thinking about your life, how does thinking about your purpose affect you right now, like literally right this second? So rather than thinking about what should I do with my life, you could say, what should I do right today? Or you can even go back one step further and don't even ask what you should do, just look at what you did. Literally, what did you do today? So you're here, so you woke up, you got dressed. So at some point you woke up. At some point you put your clothes on. Some people might have reached for their phone right away and started scrolling through messages or whatever. Some people might have had a coffee and stumbled out of bed. Some people might have woke up really early and said prayers and meditated and read the writings and whatever. But if you trace the pathway from the time you woke up until the time you go to sleep, it's a microcosm. It's a model. It's it's kind of an archetype. It's not an allegory, but it's a little snapshot of your whole life. In fact, from morning to night is kind of like birth and death a little bit. Because when you go to sleep, like there's a Persian poet that talks about death, and he says the next world he's talking about the next world as being real. And then he says, if you don't believe it's real, try not falling asleep. Try to force yourself to not fall asleep. It's impossible. At some point, you'll fall asleep. And the inevitability of sleep, he was saying, is the inevitability of death. But when you sleep, he says, also try to prevent yourself from dreaming. It's impossible to do that as well. So there's something that happens to you. So anyway, there's this little model that you could do. And you could say, what happened to me today? So I woke up. Now, some people were very purposeful when they woke up and they said, I have this plan for the day. And it starts with, say, prayers. And why would it start with prayers? Well, from a Baha'i context, it would start with prayers because that's actually one of our guiding laws, one of the principles or laws of the Baha'i faith. It's same as in Islam. It's also the same in all the religions, but they're kind of more diffuse, but you can really see it in Islam with the obligatory prayer, and you can see it in the Baha'i faith. Okay, so anyway, my point is you wake up, let's say you brush your teeth, you hurriedly, you check your phone, you hurriedly get dressed, you jump in your car, you go to the McDonald's drive-through, you grab an Egg McMuffin, you wolf down a coffee, you get to work, you catch up on your emails, you gossip with your coworker, you go for lunch. Oh, I forgot the dry cleaning. You rush to get the dry cleaning. Oh, my kid has a soccer game. You go back to work, you say goodbye, you finish your emails, you whip to the soccer game. Oh, there's a fireside tonight. Oh, I'm supposed to bring that cake, blah, blah, blah. Go grab a cake. Forgot the soccer game. Go get the kids from the soccer game, come home, go to the fireside. It's 9 o'clock, you're exhausted, you fall asleep. Like that poet, it's inevitable, you're asleep. And that was your day. So the reason that I'm making this sort of comical model or description of this day is what part of that was really conscious and what part of that was really, you were doing really what you wanted to do. You were doing it with purpose. You were doing it in a way that you really believed. Okay, so another way of looking at that is, what does that day show you about what you really believe? In other words, rather than saying to yourself, I believe in unity, I believe in justice, you could say, what part of your day demonstrates a commitment to justice? What part of your day demonstrates a commitment to faith or to love? And I'm sure there's a million examples actually what you could find that are demonstrations of love or justice. But if you ask yourself, then you'll say what that will do is it'll show you what you truly believe. So in the kind of materialistic or secular model that I'm describing, where you just rush out of bed and go on with your day, what it shows is that you might not really believe so deeply these things that you profess to believe. You might believe them, but it only really matters when it shows up in the way you act. Does everybody remember that first quote that you study on the first page of the very first book of the Institute process, the Ruhi books, the first quote? I'm sure you all know it. Who knows it?
Not Sky, because I'm sure not everyone has taken that book, but we're going to learn it. I'm sure you're going to let us know.
I'm sure somebody here has taken that book. No? Nobody has done book one?
Yes, but we don't know which one. Not your word, but not your word, but your
action be
action
your
adorning.
Yeah.
The
That word's not
the
used.
world can be accomplished through pure and goodly deeds, through commendable and seemly
Yes.
conduct.
Why stop video?
That's right. The betterment of the world can be accomplished through pure and goodly
Wait a
deeds.
minute, my sound is off.
Sorry to create chaos with getting everybody to unmute themselves.
That's better. I'm sorry.
You can go back to being muted though. Yeah, so anyway, the betterment of the world can be accomplished through pure and goodly deeds. Now, there's so much in that quote because first of all, it says there is a way to make the world better. There is a pathway that the world becomes better. But instead of it saying the betterment of the world can be achieved through slogans and berating your fellow coworkers in shame and violence, or the betterment of the world can be accomplished through materialism and war, it's pure and goodly deeds. It's such a personal, kind, soft sort of, like a nice breeze, a pure deed. So now we're in this realm of like, over the course of your day, what deed would be pure? And then you have to ask yourself, well, how would I purify a deed? And so that comes back to meaning again. Like, for example, you can hurriedly give someone something like, here's $5, go to Tim Hortons and buy something. Or you could prepare it with a certain degree of kindness and love. And so it has so much to do with your intention, right? Like if you did something for someone, how the spirit that you do it in. So it's pure and then goodly. And I think, if you talk about pure, that might have something to do with the motive, but goodly just means a good deed. And then that comes, another huge question that comes from that is what is good? And then someone could say, quit playing word games, but it's not really a game, because if you're rushing through your day and you're moving through the world, when do you stop to really think about what it is that you're doing that's actually good? And then commendable. That's an interesting word too. What is commendable? That's something that people are actually aware of and are like, wow, this is amazing what this person is doing. It's commendable, it's laudable, it's praiseworthy. And seemly conduct, commendable and seemly conduct. Anyway, I'm gonna take another. So I did a little veer. I haven't talked about art yet, but I talked about meaning and purpose. And I talked about, rather than worrying about what you think you believe, just look at what you actually do. And that will demonstrate to you what you believe. And you might not actually like what you believe. You might actually have a lot of beliefs that are toxic, or maybe toxic is the wrong word. You may believe things about yourself. Like, for example, I've heard a lot of people say, I can't do art. Like, since this is a talk about art, they say, oh, I don't do art. And then I would say, well, why not? And so I'm no good at art. So that's something you believe, but it's probably not very useful to you. It's probably not helping. Anyway, I'm going to take another slightly different tangent. And now I'm going to get a little bit philosophical. And I remember Beirut, I see Beirut is here or was here. And Beirut was saying, I'm kind of getting tired of these talks, because sometimes people just talk and their words are kind of mixed with Baha'i writings, but it's mostly them and it's a little bit Baha'i. And it's like, it's kind of just you're just kind of making up your own interpretation of things. And I don't know how useful that was. I'm saying this in a way as sort of caricaturing what Beirut was saying, because he said it in such a nice way. But the point is, he's right. We do these talks, and it is just my own, kind of in my own imagination. So what I want to make really clear at the outset is I'm not trying to really express the Baha'i position on these things, or what I think the Baha'i faith means about art or meaning. This is really just a personal reflection. And it isn't meant to be something that ties perfectly into some understanding of the faith. It's just my understanding. So the philosophical thing comes from quite a controversial philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger. And the reason he's so controversial is because he rose to sort of prominence in Germany before World War II and before the Nazis took over. And when the Nazis took over, they kind of took him under their wing, and he never really disavowed that. In other words, he was kind of co-opted by the German state and all of that. And even after the war, he never really properly distance himself from that. So there's definitely a controversial aspect to him. But what I'm referring to is something he wrote 20 years before the war. Okay, so way before all that, he wrote a book called Being in Time. Anyway, and I haven't actually read the book, I confess. I've only read little snippets of it because it's so difficult that I can't read it from cover to cover. But anyway, what I'm going to mention from that is he makes this very, very profound point. And he uses the analogy of a hammer. And this goes back to what I was saying before about what you believe, okay? What's true, what's good, and what's meaningful, and what you believe. And he said, as soon as we try to define a concept, the very act of defining it takes it away from kind of meaning and puts it into a different space, which is analytical, okay? So he says in the Western tradition of philosophy, we take any concept that we take. So for example, if you can imagine the mind as being like a table, like a laboratory table, perfect conditions to study something, okay? If you were to take a concept and put it on that table, the very act of putting it in that perfect, sterile, temperature-controlled lab of the mind takes it outside of what it is and puts it into something else. The context changes it at a fundamental level. So if we take a concept like love and we try to analyze it, the very act of analyzing it takes it in some ways away from what it really is. We can understand aspects of it, but the analysis of it doesn't necessarily get us closer to the meaning of love. But he doesn't use such a huge loaded term like love. He uses the idea of a hammer. And he puts a hammer in front of your mind. And he said, describe it. And then you might say, oh, it's a thing for hammering. And then that's not a definition. What is hammering? Oh, you take the hard end and you hit a nail. That's not a definition either. What's a nail? What's the hard end? What's it used for? Oh, you use it for building. What's building? Oh, building is when you put something together like a house to live in. What's a house? Well, a house is, blah, 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 with a family and a community. And it's like the concept of the hammer keeps spilling out indefinitely forever. You'll never get to a place where using that analytical process that allows you to define what a hammer is. And that led to really, in a lot of ways, led to postmodernism, because they said every concept is in this completely slippery hermeneutic. So in other words, interpretation, is this slippery hermeneutical kind of network that you never get to the core. So that some people made the claim that means there is no truth. There is no meaning. All meaning is interpretation. That's postmodernist theory. All meaning, all ideas, all concepts are interpretation. And what's the most important interpretation in the postmodernist realm? Power. Okay. Why the heck am I talking about Heidegger and the hammer? Because what I'm going to try to describe to you is any concept that we use to define meaning brings us into this network of definitions that go on forever, and we never land. So this is the part that I find really, and he talks a little bit about art, and this is something that I find really fascinating about art. Heidegger's take on art. He said, the true meaning of the hammer isn't found in its definition. It's found in building. And the true meaning of building is actually found in the identity of the builder. So for example, when an artist is using the tools of a studio, or a carpenter is using the tools of a shop, the carpenter is enacting his or her identity. And the true meaning is actually in the way that that tool informs the person's relationship to the world. And this is a profound way of looking at words and language, because it's saying what really matters is the way that tool gets utilized in the production of something meaningful. When it's broken, we can analyze it. But when it's working, it becomes invisible. Like when you're really outside on a hot roof, on a hot summer day, shingling a roof and it's 25 degrees in the sun, the hammer is completely invisible. It becomes an extension of your body. Same with when you're making a painting. When you're really making a painting, you're not thinking about, oh, I'm holding a piece of wood with squirrel hair attached to the end, and I'm dipping it into cadmium and cobalt and oil, and I'm making, no, you're not thinking any of those things. It's a demonstration of something that you believe. It's an act. Now, that might have been a weird tangent, but the reason for me to go that way is to say, when we ask the question of what is meaningful, we're not going to necessarily find it by answering the question with words. We find meaning in what we do. And when what we're doing is making our relationships stronger, when what we're doing is making us excited and inspired, when what we're doing is making other people around us happy and excited and inspired, when what we're doing is making us feel like we're truly fulfilling why we're on earth, then it's truthful, then it's meaningful, then it's purposeful. But if what we're doing is making us contentious and argumentative and anxious and sad and angry and hurtful and resentful and jealous and prejudiced, maybe even bigoted, whatever, then something about what we believe isn't in line with our true identity. Like, for example, Jesus uses the concept, he says, you will know the tree by its fruits. This is such a wonderful analogy. There's many passages in the Bible that have a slight variation of you will know the tree by its fruits. In other words, what is the product? What comes from it? What's it bringing forward? So in this search for meaning, there's two kind of things that I'm emphasizing. One is that language is actually quite difficult, but actions show us something about what we believe. Excuse me. But the other really important point is Baha'is don't believe that when you die, it's like turning the television off. We don't believe that death is any kind of end. We don't believe death is scary. We don't believe death is like purgatory or hell in a way. I mean, there are aspects of death that we obviously have no clue about, and that's kind of scary. And we don't really know what will happen to us when we die. But Baha'is believe very firmly that the purpose of this life is actually to prepare us, to prepare our souls for an eternal for a journey that's eternal. So as we're making our way through the world and we're asking these questions, when we have a family or a job or whatever, we know, I think we know, that really so much of this effort is kind of like planting seeds in a garden that will grow after we leave this world. And I think it's important, because this is probably go on YouTube or something. I think it's important to be really careful with my language here. I'm not trying to put forward this idea that we're going to board some spaceship and fly. I mean, we look at death as kind of like a birth into our true reality. But that true reality is unknowable right now. We can't really know it. We don't understand it. But we know that it's real, and partly we know that it's real because this is going, I guess, one more level into this philosophical question. All of the things that pertain to this world, okay, like rocks and water and grass and air, oxygen, all of the material things that pertain to this world, those are the things that get left behind. But all of the things in this world that, for example, compassion, that's not in the rocks necessarily, or in the leaf necessarily, or kindness or generosity or chastity or courtesy. So all of these higher level principles are actually an emanation of something beyond, something deeper, something that pervades the core of reality. So it's actually to that realm that we turn our attention in literature, that we turn our attention in music, that we turn our attention to in art. And so I'll get to the art right now. And Baha'u'llah makes this beautiful passage. He said, the world beyond is as different from this world as this world is different from that of the child while still in the womb of its mother. And I mean, if you contemplate that passage, it's so mysterious and powerful, because when you think about the womb, it seems so tiny. You know, it seems like this little, it's like a basketball, not even, it's like this little space, right? And the world outside of that is infinity, literally infinite space. Yet Baha'u'llah makes this case that this world that we're in right now, this infinite world with all the celestial spheres and the suns and stars, this infinite world that we're in is actually in some ways smaller than that of the womb compared to the next world. And then Abdu'l-Baha writes, therefore in this world, he must prepare himself for the life beyond. That which he needs in the world of the kingdom must be obtained here. So that's the really critical, kind of scary sentence, actually. Just as he prepared himself in the world of the matrix, the womb, by acquiring forces necessary in this sphere of existence, so likewise, the indispensable forces of the divine existence must be potentially attained in this world. And if this next world is infinite, eternal, the form that we take, the capacity that we develop is the capacity that we have eternally, which is a big responsibility. The last quote I want to read is a little bit longer, but I think it's really critical. He talks about this world and not being afraid of leaving it. He says, to hold that the spirit is annihilated upon the death of the body is to imagine that a bird imprisoned in a cage would perish if the cage were to be broken, though the bird has nothing to fear from the breaking of the cage. This body is even as the cage, and the spirit is like the bird. We observe that this bird, unencumbered by its cage, soars freely in the world of sleep. Therefore, should the cage be broken, the bird would not only continue to exist, but its senses would be heightened, its perception would be expanded, and its joy would grow more intense. In reality, it would be leaving a place of torment for a delightsome paradise. For there is no greater paradise for the grateful birds than to be freed from their cage. All right. So back to the question of meaning. If we ask what is the purpose of life, one of the core principles that we have to explore is this idea of developing these spiritual these capacities, not just for this life, but for an eternal life. How do we do that? In a sense, we do it with our deeds and kind of the relationship between what we believe and what we do. And lastly, we learn, right? It's a world of education. This world that we're in is like school. It's like we're in kindergarten. And everything we learn in kindergarten, we're going to use, even if we do a PhD in thermonuclear, whatever, physics, we still are going to learn all those principles in kindergarten. We're going to learn our ABCs. We're going to learn to read. We're going to learn to count. We're going to learn to add sums and subtract. Everything we're going to use is we're going to learn it in kindergarten. So in some ways, let's imagine that we're in kindergarten together right now, but we're learning these critical ideas. And one of the most important ideas that we could ever learn, and this is something absolutely intrinsic in the revelation of all the world's religions, is the idea of metaphor. So when you look at the sun, you not only see it as a physical thing, you see it as a symbolic thing or an allegory or a principle. So Baha'u'llah says, and he's talking about this concept of perception. He says, gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive, and when he's talking about this true seeker, this is what we refer to as the tablet to the true seeker. And it's such an incredible tablet because before he even talks about what you should look for, he talks about your conditions. And if you were to actually try to follow the conditions of the true seeker, it's just almost, it's so incredible, the conditions that are required to be a true seeker. Anyway, so assuming that you're now a true seeker, you've fulfilled the conditions. He says you will gaze with the eye of God. He will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. He will discover in all things the mysteries of divine revelation and the evidences of an everlasting manifestation. Within every blade of grass are enshrined the mysteries of an inscrutable wisdom. I was just cutting my grass and I'm thinking, each one of these things is a mystery of inscrutable wisdom. And I'm looking for like how to kill the weeds and prune the garden and all the rest of it. But this idea that every blade of grass enshrines this mystery is so beautiful. And then he says, and upon every rose bush, a myriad nightingales pour out in blissful rapture their melody. So I'll share my screen. And I'm not going to go into a big, what's the word? I'm going to just show a few images. This isn't going to be an art historical lecture, and I'm not going to focus only on my work, but I'm just going to pick up on this concept of meaning, this concept of action, and this concept of metaphor, that all of these things are leading us somewhere. It's not arbitrary, it's not random, it's not meaningless, it's absolutely meaningful, and it's leading us all somewhere, this life. Okay, so Jean-Francois Millet was a French painter, and you might not know his work, but you do know it because he was absolutely critical to artists like Van Gogh. Okay, and I'm going to show you that in a second. Now, when you look at this painting, what is going on in this painting? And at first glance, you could be fooled into thinking that it's mundane or that it's, I don't know, simple or whatever. The reason I chose this painting is because he started painting right about the time of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. In fact, one of his great masterpieces was painted in 1863. Now, so when you look at a painting, you can ask yourself certain questions. The first question you can ask, don't ask yourself, what does it mean yet? Just ask yourself, what is it? What is it? It's a picture of three women. Okay, what are they doing? They're picking up seeds. Why? Because after the harvest, you would pick up the seeds and you can sow those seeds again. So on an allegorical level, you're already in this realm of, well, why would you sow seeds? Why would you pick them up and sow them? Well, that is something about life, right? Something about the harvest, which is what? You come in and you cut all the wheat. You cut it down. But then the next step is you replant it. And I think that is an allegory about the next world. Why would he choose to talk about the next world with these frumpy sort of like, look at their hands. You know, they're big. They're like, maybe they're kind of tanned and almost not dirty, but you know, they're working hands. Why would he choose that subject to talk about something so, you know, whatever, as the next world? And the reason is Millet was trying to take art away from the large churches, you know, like someone's texting me and it's throwing me off. not the, when you go to a church, you would see that the large descriptions of the saints, and you would see the whole hierarchy of God, and then Jesus and the saints, and then you might even see the king and the queen and the aristocracy. So what Millet was doing was he was trying to take these concepts and place it within the realm of these common people. And he was also trying to show that God was in these common people, because at the time in art, nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever said beauty is with these farmers, ever. This is a first. And not only is he giving them beauty, but he's bathing them in this incredible light. That's another thing with Millet. Nobody really did plein air painting. I mean, there was some plein air outside painting in France and Holland, but Millet takes this concept of the light that's coming from outside to a whole new level. That's what led to Impressionism. All right. Now the allegory becomes even more kind of specific here. This is a drawing by Millet of sowing the seeds. And this idea of the sower of seeds is kind of relates to Christianity. It kind of relates to Jesus. But it also relates to this idea of you reap what you sow. And again, he's bathing, this is a drawing, so it's a study for his famous painting. 1851. So just on a very surface level, it's a person, it's a common person, and this common person is doing something very practical, which is sowing these seeds. And the light that he's putting them into is a religious light. You can see that really with this one in 1864. So there's a grace, a dignity, a kind of nobility, a beauty that he's finding in this common everyday scene with a person and their sheep. And there's a lot that could be said about Millet because his work kind of creates the conditions for modernism. So this is a painting by Van Gogh where he's taking a painting from Millet, a different painting, also with someone sowing the seeds, and he's repeating it. He's kind of copying it. And one thing that you can note, if you've ever looked at Van Gogh's paintings and if you're interested in them, I would say in some ways, all of his paintings are like a prayer a little bit, like almost literally, like he was trying to express his love for God. He was very clear about that. He wrote about it a lot in his letters. In fact, before he was an artist, he was a preacher. He was a priest. He was like not a Free Methodist, but anyway, he's a preacher in Holland. But he was so intense that he made everybody uncomfortable, and he didn't last very long as a preacher. And this is also Van Gogh's depiction of Millet. And now you're seeing Van Gogh using all of his artistic energy, his power, his vision, his talent to express something. And it's connected to Millet. It's connected to that common person. It's connected to the landscape. But now that sun that we were talking about, that light, he's making it absolutely emphatic and direct. And this is a divine light. But it's also a very physical, it's a space that he was actually in the south of France as well. Here's a drawing he made from Millet. So why am I talking about Millet and Van Gogh? The one reason is because I think it's interesting to see how much of an impact Millet had on Van Gogh, because we're so familiar with Van Gogh. But the other reason is because what Millet was trying to express, Van Gogh took to a whole new level. Now, this painting, to me, the reason I wanted to talk about it today was because it isn't a picture of the sun or the stars. It's a frumpy little rental. It's like an Airbnb. It's a tiny little room. It's a real room in Arles, in France. And he was kind of getting it fixed up for a visit by Gauguin. And he hung his paintings all around the walls as a kind of show for Gauguin. He wanted to impress, no, I don't know if he wanted to impress him. He wanted to show him what he was doing. And this painting is a masterpiece, and it's so simple and it's so direct and it's so honest. And that's another thing about this, going back to this idea of faith. It's one thing to describe something in these big, grandiose terms, but it's another just to like look really closely at your life. What does it look like? And just the act of looking that closely actually elevates it to this place of incredible beauty. But in fact, it wasn't beautiful, really. It was a little shabby rental property that he could barely afford because he had almost no money. But he painted this painting there. He painted 4 sunflower paintings in that room in that time, and Gauguin got one of them. And now they're the most valuable. I think they're some of the most valuable artworks in the world. I think one sold for close to $200 million, some crazy amount. But anyway, this painting too, you could ask yourself, well, what is it? It's sunflowers. Okay, what are those? Like the Heidegger thing, you know, like what's a sunflower? Oh, it's a flower. You know, what's a flower? You know, well, in this case, the sunflower has all of this connection to that, the sun, but also the space that he was in the south of France, like the very physical space, like the landscape. But it's something that's kind of contained, right? A lot of people talk about these as being studies of mortality as well, because they're all cut flowers, and so they're very temporary. And he kind of freezes them. But also there's something I haven't talked about at all today because of the time. And that's just the materiality of the painting. Like when you look at its color and you look at its texture, why did he put so much emphasis on the color? Nobody else had ever done that before. Van Gogh was the first artist ever to make color the subject of his work, which leads to Impressionism. This is a hard transition, because now I'm showing you some of my work, and I'm not trying to, putting it beside the sunflower painting is ridiculous because it's just going to completely obliterate what I'm trying to talk about. But I wanted to do it because I was thinking about all of those things that Van Gogh had shown me. You know, I was thinking about the flower, the sunflower. So this is kind of an homage in a way to the sunflower. It's a big painting. It's 6 by 8 feet. And it's called Gleanings, which was in part taken from the really wonderful book that we all have that we love so much, which is a series of passages translated by Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, the grandson of Abdul Baha, where he selected key passages from the Revelation of Baha'u'llah and translated them. So his translations are like these precious gems. The Revelation is an ocean, and then there's these precious gems that have been distilled in a way in his translation. This painting has nothing, I'm not trying to put the painting in that context. I'm just saying I called it Gleanings because I was thinking about trying to distill something, trying to take something, trying to learn something from this kind of metaphorical space of Millet and Van Gogh, actually. This painting is called The Black Sea. And it's another large painting, 6 by 8, and the feet, and the top part is this, the painting is kind of layered in sand. Sort of hard to describe, but it's a flat, matte, black, blue, kind of indigo. It's just very, very, very matte. There's no reflection. It's dark. And so this was a meditation also on the sea, but also on the horizon. The kind of specificity of all of these little, like the language of geometry, like the little diamonds and the fractals in the sea, and then the movement, kind of like the feeling of the waves. And it's kind of a reference in some ways to Rothko, the painter Rothko. If you don't know Mark Rothko, you probably really love his work. It's also a meditation on the idea of mortality and that horizon line that kind of disappears in a way in this painting. Like it kind of just, it's an interesting relationship between the sea and the horizon. From that same series, it's a garden with the moon. I call this painting The Caged Lark, from a poem called The Caged Lark. I didn't think ahead enough to get that poem. Oh, it's called The Caged Skylark. And my name being Sky was also a little bit thinking about the idea of the skylark. Here, I'll read it. It's such a great poem. It's by the poet who was a Jesuit, I believe, Jared Manley Hopkins. As a dare gale skylark scanted in a dull cage. So the skylark is a bird. Man's mounting spirit in his bone house, mean house dwells. So it's interesting because we had this analogy earlier with the bird in the cage. So this is fitting. That bird beyond the remembering his free fells. This in drudgery, day laboring out life's age. Though aloft on turf or perch or poor low stage, both sing sometimes the sweetest, sweetest spells. Yet both droop deadly sometimes in their cells, or ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. So he's saying, I'm like a bird in my cage. Like his brain, his consciousness, his identity is sort of trapped in this body. And the bird is also sort of trapped in this cage. And the bird sings these beautiful songs, and he's a poet. So he's also creating these beautiful poems. Not that the sweet fowl, song fowl needs no rest. Why hear him babble and drop down to his nest, but his own nest, wild nest, no prison. Man's spirit will be flesh bound when found at best, but unencumbered, meadow down is not distressed. For a rainbow footing it nor he for his bones risen. Sorry. Anyway, so this cage skylark is this idea of the bird in his cage. And in the top left-hand part of the painting, I had a cage. And then I kind of opened it up and it doesn't really look like a cage anymore because it was too literal. But it was just this idea of like what we've been talking about today, the idea that there's this physicality, there's this space that we inhabit, and then there's this light kind of in the distance and whatever. It's a large painting too, 6 by 8 feet. And then I did another painting from that series of a mountain. I won't go into any great lengths about this one other than to say that it's just really flat and sort of playing with the structure of a mountain. The idea of it, rather than thinking about it just as a kind of silhouette, thinking about it as almost like a body or like a garment or some kind of surface. Another painting that you could say is quite indebted to Van Gogh, of stars. And then I did this painting of the sun. I mean, it's sort of obvious to me, I think, in a way, because it's so directly connected to the sun, but it's a large painting. I think this one is either 6 by 8 or 7 by 9. Anyway, it's a large piece and it's very physical and very kind of intense. So I was trying to juggle this idea of this sort of raw material of the painted surface, like the raw kind of paint itself with the kind of just extremely diffused light. And I did it again. I did another version of it where there's two worlds and one kind of point of light is being reflected, on the bottom of the painting. So the bottom of the painting, like the Black Sea, is this matrix of sort of diamonds and it's almost like a net, but it's kind of like a net for capturing all the light. It's just all about the way the water reflects light. And the top part of the painting is actually very physical, almost like when you take a tree and you cut through it, the rings of it, like it doesn't really look like light or space, but we read it that way. So it's kind of like making the top part of the painting, which was sort of this infinite open space, something really, really physical and like just incredibly, like it's all sand and paint. It's very physical. And the bottom part of the painting, just making it really about light. I don't know really what else to say, but I wanted to leave it at that and just let people ask questions or if they had any thoughts. That's where I'm going to conclude my little talk about art and religion and meaning.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Sky, that was amazing. Wow. I'm so excited. I feel like I got an education today. I love art, but I actually don't, I haven't put enough into my own education. And you really said so much that really fired me up. I loved it. So friends, Sky is available for questions here. If you'd like to just put questions in the chat that way, of course, you can put your hand up, or I'll read the questions that come in through the chat. Sky, that was fabulous. Okay, let's go to Nikki. Go ahead, Nikki.
Thank you, Sky. It was a beautiful contribution to the arts, as well as I really loved your artwork. I am an artist myself, a little bit, so I do watercolor as well as, acrylic and so forth. I just wondered whether you use any kind of computer, app in your painting for doing this, this kind of waves in the sea. Do you use any of those or not at all? These are all.
No, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'll just quickly show you my screen. This is what I do. Like I will make these little studies. So this is a small work on paper.
Okay.
So if I find something that I like, for example, this tree,
Mm-hmm.
I make sure not to use the photo.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do instead is I will make watercolors and like drawings from it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but you don't use any app. You know how they have this
yeah,
different
I wouldn't say I don't use an app, because sometimes I do use the photo app to crop, or like here's a photo that I found. I made a little drawing of that. And then if you see behind me, that painting in the background, a big one there, that's from that little photo. So I try to just make, so if I find a thing that I like that, I made a little study, my own little study. And but the reason I'm emphasizing this is because it's so important. Like to go from a photo or from like this was around the corner from my house. I saw this tree. And so I made this little drawing or this watercolor from it. And I do that, like this is a big painting that I have behind me, a big painting of I called it eclipse. Anyway, so this is how it looked before when I was working on it.
But you didn't use any computerized, what I mean, it's some app in, that people, they buy it.
This is what they look, this is the app. The app is my brain.
Okay, that's what I meant.
I make
thank you so much, yeah.
This part of it though, like even if you want to use an app, the idea of taking something like this image from Van Gogh, right? And then how do you absorb it? Well, there's a million ways to absorb it. But for me, I make these little drawings, these studies, these watercolors, and that process of translating it into a little sketch is this is a painting that I have up right now in New York.
Beautiful.
It's of another painting of a mountain.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I don't know if I can show you, but I have a drawing that I made of that I used. And like I said, that's a very critical. I was going to try to show you this before, but I didn't have time to include this in my talk. But these little sketches like that, I'm just scrolling by. Yeah, just a really important part.
Beautiful, beautiful. So you first sketch and then afterwards you do your painting.
Yeah, like I might do a drawing first, and then from the drawing do a watercolor, a small painting, and from the small painting I will make a bigger painting. But usually when I make a bigger painting, like if you can see the works behind me, this is my my studio window. But if you see, here's a little sketch there.
Oh yeah, I can see.
And this is the piece that I'm working on from that sketch.
Oh, okay.
But I will kind of completely destroy that at some point, so that I'm not really bothered with that sketch anymore.
Yeah. Is that an oil painting?
Sorry?
You're painting oil painting?
Yeah, oil, yeah.
Oil, okay. Thank you so much for your information. Really loved all your paintings. They are very, very beautiful. And do you get, the ideas that comes to you beside, looking at very famous artists, but is that anything from the writings or, from the Baha'i book that you read? I think some of your painting was about that, but do you take a lot of things also from your faith?
Yeah, but indirectly. I mean, there are some passages, especially from the Bab, passages that he uses is very strong imagery of a tree. Like I did a painting of a tree. I guess I should try to show you, but it's behind me here, but I've put it away because I don't want to be surrounded by all my paintings all the time, because it gets a bit overwhelming. But this one here, if you see, this is a blue tree. It's very, very intense. And this is, I would say, has a connection to the writings of the Bab. I called it the lote tree.
Oh, that's beautiful.
The lote tree is the Satratul Mantaha, right? The tree beyond there is no passing. Now that, I don't really mean it that way, like in a literal way. I just mean I was inspired by that idea of a lote tree. I'm not saying I made a lote tree. It's just, this was what kind of, sometimes like these are image. Oh, that's not the one. So I was going to show you. This is not what I was trying to grab, but there was some photos I have from Soleimani, from the mountains of Kurdistan. That Baha'u'llah was in the mountains of Kurdistan. That mountain painting that I showed you before originally came out of thinking about the mountains that he was in Kurdistan. But it's not meant to be a direct relationship.
Thank
Sky,
you so much. Thank you.
In the chat, if you could show that mountain painting again.
Yeah.
That and there was a second one as well. That's just Sky.
Oh, the other one. Yeah, the other one.
Beautiful.
Yeah, the other one I have it just in the here. The show that it's in New York, it's in a very, very prominent gallery right now, and the show is on landscape painting. And so I was very fortunate to be invited to show that painting.
Do you sell your paintings? Sorry.
Yep, I do. Well, I don't sell them, but I have a kind of like an agent or a dealer who does that. He's based in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Sky.
Find that painting again. Here it is. Oh, here's a little video of it. I don't know why I have a video of it. Maybe just to see the surface. It's very hard to see photos like this, or in paintings, I mean.
Sky, we're looking at your presentation on the screen.
Oh, you can't see it? Sorry.
No.
Sorry. I am doing the wrong one. There we go. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah. I did this little video for my gallery in Los Angeles because Well, it's a long story, but I was trying to give him as much information as I could because he wasn't going to get a chance to see it before I sent it to New York.
Beautiful.
So let me just get the photo. Here we go. Oh, so here's a detail. You can see the surface is quite, what I don't know what the word is. It's built up. It's like many layers, and colors kind of come through the layers. Like up close, this is very abstract. It doesn't look anything like a mountain. Like those triangles are really meant to be triangles. And the fact that I emphasize them so much by having orange paint shooting out, outlining them, was a way of really emphasizing the fact that there really are triangles. But then within the larger framework, they become part of the, this painting is kind of about triangles, actually. I know that sounds ridiculous, but can you see it still? So on the left-hand side, can you see my mouse, the cursor? Yeah, so this is a triangle right here, and here's another triangle. And then all of these are little triangles, and every single passage is a triangle. And all the triangles kind of converge on this little point. So it's not really that I was obsessed with triangles. It was just that as a way of making the painting meaningful, I was trying to say the triangle that's here is also related to the one that's here. And that's part of what you're trying to do in a painting. You set something up like for example, I set this very, very dark blue up so that this area would become very light. This wouldn't be light if this wasn't dark. So this little triangle of light, darkness, sorry, creates the opportunity for that.
How long it takes for you to finish a painting?
Usually if I'm on a roll, about a month.
You're very prolific, Sky. Shala Jan, I see your hand up. You go ahead.
I'm fascinated by your paintings because it gives me different images, as I'm Middle Eastern and Persian, and it's part of my history. But it's interesting that you look at the 18th century paintings. I see them slightly differently. For example, the Gleaners made me think of Mullah Hussein, Bob, when he goes to Isfahan. The first person that he teaches the faith is a gleaner of the wheat.
Right.
And so that when I see that painting, it immediately brings to mind the early days of the Bahá'í dispensation.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that how our culture also affects the way we look at things. Also, when you talked about hammer, of course, immediately, I don't know who else is from my century of early days of music. It makes me think of Peter, Paul, and Mary, Hammer in the Morning. I don't know if anyone remember that.
Yep. Yep. And Cat Stevens also has a song about a hammer.
I couldn't get the tune out of my head as you were talking about the hammer. Of course, I don't know if you know, because they wrote it in the 40s to do with the workers, the laborers, the, you know,
yeah.
Yes, and of course it's just during and just after the war and the agony of the working class and the lack of things. So and of course unity, it also immediately, as it sings, it brings it to actually almost like the writings of the Bab. It's fascinating that so much of what was produced in the 40s and 50s reflects the need for this dispensation. So, and of course, the colors you're using, it's interesting to me. Is it all oil? All of your works are oil?
The large works are oil, the small ones are watercolor.
It does look like some of them are watercolor, but you seem to kind of sort of bring your faith into sort of developing. And I'm wondering if I'm right. It seems that so much of what you have, even what you talk about, is even though it's about meaning of life, you're talking about your paintings. Is that right?
Well, you bring up a number of things. One thing I wanted to go back to was the thing with Mullah Hussein and the sifter of wheat, which is the name of Sarvastani, from Sarvastan, right? And that sifter of wheat went on to become the great-grandfather of so many distinguished Baha'is. So of course, the sifter of wheat is in my mind when I see the painting by Millet, but the fact that it was painted at the same time that Baha'u'llah was revealing his revelation is also interesting. I'm not saying there's a direct correlation. I'm saying there is this kind of, it's permeating the air. So on that point though, I think this is a very, very, very critical point. I didn't talk about it much during this talk, but sometimes when someone says, what's true, is the story true, or is like a document, like a legal document, true? And in the West, we don't really emphasize poetry and dreams that much, but in the East, say in Iran, there's a lot of emphasis on dreams and on poetry. So truth for me is the distillation of all of these things into something that's so perfectly composed that you could read it 1,000 times, and every time you read it, you're getting something from it. Truth doesn't necessarily mean at 8 a.m. he went to the store, at 8:15 he came home, like data or like evidence. And of course, in the empirical, like in the Western tradition, there's an emphasis on the empirical, like reproducible experiments that we can really predict the results. There's so much emphasis in the West on being objective, on being scientific, on being factual, on being truthful in a scientific way, which has led to a lot of the great discoveries. But there's a de-emphasis, there's a loosening of this other deeper truth, which is poetic truth. So yes, that gleaner is actually connected to Mullah Hussein and to that, because those stories are not just specific to that one point in time. Those stories echo forever. And that echoing is what gives them their truth too. It's like some stories, you hear it once and it fizzles out. Some you see it once, like those sunflowers of Van Gogh. People worship those paintings. I mean, almost literally worship them, especially in Japan. They love Van Gogh's paintings so much. So are they true? Is it literally a thing? Well, in a way, yes, but on a deeper level, it's true. So that's the first thing. And the thing about the Peter, Paul, and Mary and the hammer, I absolutely agree with you. I think there was a desire, especially in the 60s, to take these old stories from the Bible. And it was really connected to the civil rights movement in the United States, right? To take those anthems, to take those stories, to take those biblical teachings and to turn them into a song that would galvanize people. And I think we've lost a lot of that kind of, that spirit of unity and that galvanizing spirit that comes from the Bible, or comes from these deeper narratives. So anyway, those are 2 points that I want. And the last point about, am I inspired by, I think you were asking, I mean, I think, I'm the son-in-law of Otto Rogers, of Don Rogers.
I see the similarity.
Well, there's some similarities, but the reason I bring that up is because I had a lifelong relationship with Don when it came to art. And when I was very young, he did 2 things. One thing was he really encouraged me. But the way he encouraged me was like, he put me aside and he said, you're married to my youngest daughter. I never wanted her to marry a loser artist. I always wanted something better for her, blah, 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 blah. But having seen your art and having seen your energy and your whatever, if you try, you could become a real artist. He said to me at the very beginning. So he really, he encouraged me on a very deep level. But the other thing that I remember from him, he was serving in the Holy Land when I visited him when we first got married. And he had a studio there. And I asked him about prayer and his art. And I said, I can't remember exactly how I phrased the question, but he turned to me and I wrote it down. He turned to me and he said, don't play games with the Holy Spirit. And that always stuck with me. And what I think he meant was, don't be so arrogant to think the Holy Spirit is guiding you in your stupid art on one level. Now, you might get to a point where there's a moment where something beautiful happens, or that's fine, but don't go around thinking that you're going to connect yourself to the Holy Spirit. And if you do, watch out. Because the way the Holy, and even talking about it, I'm worried. I'm not superstitious, but I know I've had this happen. But the reason I'm worried is because the way inspiration happens is through suffering. So when you want to be really connected to the Holy Spirit, you want to really be connected to inspiration, you want to be connected to your art, watch out. Because the way to it is through really through a lot of suffering.
And I want to just say that the mountain of Soleimani, when you put that up, it gave me a chill. Because it made me think of the caves. Somehow the triangles came reflected on me as the caves in the mountain of Soleimani. And it just gave me a chill saying that, and this stone path and the triangles reflects the inside and outside of the mountain to me. I don't know if that's what you meant to do.
That's nice. Yeah. Thank you.
I want to squeeze this question in, then I'm going to turn off the recording in case anyone had a last question or two of more personal nature. Sure. But it was about meditation and if that's part of your routine before you do a painting.
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm very ADHD. Like I'm very hyper and I'm not manic, but I kind of am when I'm painting. Like I get really, like I'm already kind of like fired up, but when I'm painting I get really like, so meditation is really hard for me. The idea of just closing your mind. But what I can do and what I like to do, well, there's two things. One is I like to walk and I can meditate quite a bit when I'm walking. Like my mind isn't racing when I'm walking. Like I really love, like we moved out to the country and I absolutely love just walking around here. There's these huge, like when I say huge, I mean like massive maple trees and massive cottonwood trees and poplars and walnuts and anyway, and eagles, like big golden eagles, massive, huge golden eagles and bald eagles and turkey vultures and blue jays. And anyway, so for me, meditation, I have a really hard time just sitting down and meditating. But if I go for a walk, I try to get myself in the frame of mind where I'm really looking. And I can do that in museums too. Like I can really focus when I'm in a museum. Like I see people come and go and I'm like, how could you take that painting in like 3 seconds? Like I've been staring at this painting all morning and I'm still can't get enough of it. And I'll see someone just walk by it in like less than a second to just walk right by it. So meditation for me needs a focus. And so I like to focus in on something like a poem or a prayer or the writings of our holy writings, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, the revelation of the Bab. I'm not one of these people who can just sit and kind of clear my mind. I've tried. But however, when I'm making art, I spend a lot of time. Like sometimes I'm not exaggerating. I might spend an entire afternoon, like from 1 till 3, literally just sitting and staring at a painting, just looking at it and falling asleep and then waking up and looking at it and then keep looking at it. And it's sort of like meditation, but if you do it long enough, all the problems become so glaringly obvious. Like the more you look at it, they just speak back to you. So I don't meditate as much as just try to really focus my energy on something, and then focus so much that I lose focus and I'm not even thinking anymore. It's just sort of like being with it. But the idea of sort of like transcendental meditation, or like the kind of Buddhist Zen meditation where you really clear yourself of thought, I can't do it for even 3 seconds. So
that's a great, honest answer, Sky. And with that, I think that's a nice place to stop recording.
okay.